Well, the big thing there for me is that everybody talked about it, talks about residential school in those kinds of terms. That you have to ask yourself what they were being taught. I mean, what grated on me, a whole bunch of things grated on me during the apology. But to call the residential schools an educational institution is an outright lie. They weren't getting any education there. To learn how to read and write sufficiently to be, a farmhand or to be a cook is not what you call. We're bringing Indians into. We're inviting Indians into the Canadian polity. That's not true at all. The place that was being made for First Nations people, mopping floors, digging ditches, flipping hamburgers. So what we were being invited into in the residential school, what was being prepared for us, was our place as menials. We were to be the peons. That doesn't mean that there weren't going to be non-Indian peons. When you have a class society where some people are living on the backs of others, you need a whole bunch of peons because, it's pyramidal in shape. There are fewer people at the top than there are at the bottom. But the people at the bottom, nobody really cares what color they are or where they come from. And so what the Indians were learning their place in the residential schools. And that's not an education, that's an ideology. When you're taught that what you can aspire to, after 10 years at McDonald's, hey, I'm going to be the chief hamburger flipper, I'm going to only $0.50 under minimum wage. Those are the aspirations that are being taught, you're not being conditioned to become a member of Canadian society. You're being conditioned to be a piece of wood, some kind of apparatus that's useful to somebody. Well, their Indians would be considered admissible to the extent that they were useful along the margins of Canadian society. Let's face it, a lot of people don't. Say the judges of Canada, the members of Parliament, the bureaucrats of Canada don't have their aspirations that their children will become ditch diggers, right? But ditch diggers are needed. People are needed to pick up trash and sweep the streets and so on and so on. So we got to have a few of those. And the residential schools, first of all, they weren't too concerned with the quality of life in them. If Indians died in residential school, well, okay, fine. If some of them make them through, fine. But what the residential school was not graduating were people who were going to compete with the upper classes in terms of highly paid jobs or authoritative positions. I mean, one of the things that you don't want are Indians who can read the treaties, or Indians who will read the memoirs of the non-Indians who signed the treaties, who did the sharp dealing. They're not going to want Indians who can read what it says in international law. I mean, just take for a moment, why did Canada allow to put in that subsection E under Article 2, taking or forcibly removing children from the group and putting them under control of another group? They could only do that under the notion that Indians were never going to learn how to read. And consequently, since none of them were going to complain that they had taken and were taking Indians from their families and putting them under control of other people, and that Indians would never learn how to read properly or understand international law, or if they did learn, they'd learn how to read, the Bible and hymn books and so on, and the instructions on a spatula or a shovel. That's all they needed to learn how to read. But Indians would never be smart enough, have enough acumen to actually understand what was going on. I mean, in a lot of ways, that's behind the apology, the non-apology that took place on June 11th, is that Harper could only do that under the notion that the smartest Indians in the world are the morons that he invited down to listen and to accept his, quote, apology, unquote. Now, maybe the people that he invited did demonstrate that they didn't have that acumen, but it must be a great fear of Canadians in general, that Indians are actually going to learn enough to compete intellectually with First Nations people. If you again go back to Raphael Lemkin, his writing on colonialism said that colonial policy has to keep Native populations in a state of perpetual ignorance. They have to institutionalize that. Again, because it helps them maintain their hegemony over these populations. It allows the colonizing nation to prepare a place that it's willing to let First Nations people occupy, and no more. To go no further than that. That means, I don't know, low-paying jobs. That means a lot of drunkenness, a lot of family breakdown. It certainly means the destruction of the forms of life that First Nations people were engaged in before that. Really, there's a very large kind of anti-intellectualism built into First Nations forms of life now. It's not that Indians can't be intellectuals or can't be smarter, but they learned the same racist lessons that the residential schools had. One of the reasons that you could close the residential schools was that you now had a public education system that worked just as effectively as the residential school system did in terms of creating the kind of alienated First Nations youth as the residential schools was creating. There's a sort of a turnoff associated with Indian issues, that somehow Indians are, an archaic issue, and that Indians have to come into the 20th century or the 21st century, whichever century. I think it would be quite possible to create the kind of mindset in everybody, not just in First Nations people, but in Canadians in general also, the kind of mindset that would be necessary to undo this particular damage and build a better world. That's why it's so important that the forces behind the operation of the residential school, that they be in control of the educational system, of the public relations system, and so on. I don't know how many times I've seen over and over newspaper headlines, people talking about this is the great apology is now ended, this chapter, this bad chapter of Canadian history. Everybody wants to turn the page and run ahead so quickly, and there's a reason. Because if you sit and you examine, you begin to realize, well, wait a second. They have very carefully avoided dealing with the issue. This is a public relations exercise. This is not an exercise in undoing harm. This is an exercise in furthering the harm. That takes an analytic mind, and it takes discipline, and it takes knowledge of lots of little pieces of things, and to see an overall picture, and that's all destroyed.